start. Okay, let's get going. So, hello and welcome to this conversation event with artist Sarah Taylor Silverwood on Thursday, the 3rd of September 2020. My name is Vickie Fear. I'm the Curator Programme Manager at Aspex in Portsmouth, where it has been an absolute joy to present Sarah's solo exhibition Daphne since the 17th of January. And the images you'll have seen as you've joined Zoom are photos of the exhibition. We had hoped to have Sarah in the building to talk about her work back in the spring, but this was of course postponed due to lockdown. Our building has now reopened and Daphne continues to be open to visitors until this Sunday, the 6th of September. So there's still time if you'd like to visit the show in person. For full info about visiting the gallery, please see the Know Before You Go page in the visit section of our website, aspex.org.uk. Although we're not currently hosting events or workshops at Aspex, it's a real pleasure to be able to host this event on Zoom, and we're recording this to share on our YouTube channel. Sarah and I will be talking for roughly 40 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions from people watching at home or wherever you may be. You can type questions into the Q&A pop-up box by clicking on the icon at the bottom of the page. As I've already said, we're recording this, so if you would prefer to ask a question anonymously, you can do that. The chat function should also be available, but please consider that for Sarah and I, lots of chat popping up can be quite distracting. For anyone unable to see Sarah and I, I'm a white woman with long brown hair sitting in the staff office at Aspex. Sarah is a white woman with blonde hair and clear frame glasses sitting in her home in Birmingham with beautiful hand-drawn smiling flowers behind her. That's all the housekeeping, and I'm really pleased to introduce Sarah Taylor Silverwood. Sarah works in a range of media, including animation, ceramics and print. She's interested in drawing and language and their shared histories. Recent solo projects include Crowd Show at NN Contemporary, the Multistory 28 Commission, and residencies at the British Consulate in Chicago and the University of Birmingham. In 2018, Sarah was awarded the Feeney Fellowship for work in animation, and she is part of Modern Clay Co-op and Feminist Work for Change. Hello, Sarah.
Hello.
So, not everyone joining us will have seen the show in person, and it feels quite important to give a bit of background to the work. The title Daphne directly references the Greek myth Daphne and Apollo. And could you start by talking about how you came across the story and why it felt important to develop the work responding to it?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everybody. I guess like the Daphne story, I'd come across it, I think probably quite a lot in the past, because the central story is essentially this woman called Daphne who's exploring a kind of landscape. She then encounters Apollo, and there is like a really long extended chase scene, and then she turns into a tree. So that kind of like image of her turning into the tree is something I'd seen a lot in like art history, but like maybe not really known what that reference was. And then I'd come across the story a few years ago, in kind of read it in a bit more detail, because I found this book that belonged to my gran, and that was called The First Stories, and it had this like list of early myths, mainly Greek myths, and like short versions of them, and then at the end of every myth it would have like a list of references to that myth in other forms of popular culture. So it had like Shakespeare plays where that kind of story structure might have been used, or bits of classical music or poetry. So I think I was starting to think a lot about the way that those early story structures are repeating through history.
Mm.
And especially the chase scene being this like motif that is just in so many films, so many cartoons, has like a really rich history in animation as well. And I think more widely that the story resonated with me because it's like a predator prey story. Essentially, it's about a power imbalance, and it's like about a not providing an alternative narrative to the chase being something which is like thrilling for the predator, but maybe not so for the prey. So yeah, I think it was rereading it as an adult. I think it, I just saw it slightly differently.
Yeah, of course. And that sort of idea of narrative felt like a really important consideration when we were thinking about the layout of the show as well, so that kind of communicated through. But could you describe that journey that you kind of wanted to take visitors to the gallery on, and how you wanted that story to kind of unfold as you moved around?
So I think the exhibition itself has got lots of kind of cut out sculptures, and there's two sculptures which are kind of boulders. There's one massive boulder in the centre of the exhibition which houses the film. I think the film is really the centre of the exhibition, and everything else is kind of an expanded part of the film. And the central boulder which houses those three television screens is you kind of, as you enter the exhibition, you have to kind of move yourself around the boulder to see everything, and so you end up doing this kind of circular movement around that central structure. And the boulders themselves they became like a really important bit of imagery for me, because I've been doing a lot of research into animation history and the way that like a chase scene is inherent to animation. And it's like in the really early cartoons, they would use loads of them because you'd have these like a central structure like a boulder, and then you'd have like one character running around like Porky Pig or something, running around the front of the boulder, and then you'd have the like wolf chasing him around it as well. And then they just copy paste that bit of film, so it was basically an economical reason that they started implementing a chase scene as part of early cartoons. So there was like a few reasons I think for that boulder being there, but essentially it kind of takes the viewer on that like journey in order to see the exhibition.
Yeah, and you're saying about the cartoons, Roadrunner and Porky Pig. What is it about those sort of cartoons and that really traditional style of animation that interests you?
I guess, well, I'm kind of interested in that style of animation, but I think my real like passion for animation comes from like the experimental independent animators of the 70s. There was a lot of feminist animation coming out of that era, and there's this kind of real rise of these incredible animation works which are all hand drawn. They're all about the body. There's a lot of work about touch and about kind of subcultures and feminism that's coming out of that period. So I think in a way that was like one of my kind of reasons for getting into animating myself, was through that kind of history. But I'd always been interested in like comics and cartoon making as a kind of drawing practice. And I think when I've been kind of researching those big animation houses, as well as spent a lot of time at Lux in London looking at their archive of animation. And I think the thing that I was really drawn to with the big animation houses is the way that they use these like style sheets to make everything look the same. So if you're making a big cartoon like The Simpsons or like a Disney film, they use these style guides which say but yeah, a good example is like in The Simpsons, the eye of all the characters is 7 pupils wide. So you have the circle of the eye, and then the circle of the pupil inside it. It's always exactly that geometry, 7 pupils wide, and that's one of the rules in the Simpsons style sheets. So every person working there has this kind of like geometric rules to make things look the same. And I think like there was like for me like a parallel when I was making this work, because I was thinking about those early narrative structures and the way that they're repeated through history in different forms, and then the way that these style sheets mean that, you know, you can take an eye from The Simpsons totally out of context and you can kind of still recognize that it's an eye from The Simpsons. The same with like Bart's hair. I think it's maybe like 7 or 9 equilateral triangles for his spiky hair, something like that. And at the time I'd been making loads of ceramics based on those rules. So yeah, I think there was something about that which I found kind of interesting as this studio-based practice, that people following these rules.
I remember when I came to see you in your studio, I suppose it's a couple of years ago now, and you were showing me some of those style sheets that you'd found, and how is it Minnie Mouse has, like, she's basically Mickey Mouse but has some eyelashes. So the rules are that if you're going to draw Minnie, you've got to pop a couple of eyelashes on there.
Yeah. And a bow, that's a really common one. Just put a bow on a character.
Yeah, and it's female.
Yeah.
I'd like us to talk about a few of the kind of main aspects of the show, so like the colour palette and the soundtrack, and starting with that colour palette, which is a really kind of ice creamy selection of pastels, which references another artist's work, and I wondered if you'd like to talk about that.
Yeah, I love that. The palette. It was so the colour palette within the sculptures is, as Vickie said, these like pastel yellows and pinks and blues, and it basically comes from a work by Duncan Grant. It's a fabric print that was made in the 1930s and produced for Alan Walton Textiles, and it was called Daphne and Apollo. So
let me just show it up on the screen.
So I've been researching, there it is. So I've been researching different ways that the Daphne story had appeared and reappeared through culture, particularly through popular culture in like the 20th century. I was kind of interested in whether or not it was, there was some versions of it which, like I've taken it as just Daphne's story rather than the Daphne and Apollo story. I was kind of interested in how it was portrayed, so I've been looking a lot at references to that story structure, and at the same time I'd been doing a lot of research about the Amiga Workshop, who were a kind of shop and workshop in central London in the early 1900s, and they made they kind of had famous artists working for them like Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell and Roger Fry, and they made like artworks for domestic use, so like rugs and wallpapers and fabrics for people to have in their homes. And I'm in a ceramics cooperative and part of various groups, so I've been particularly interested in their model of working. And this fabric was kind of that era, so it for me it was this kind of, I guess, like an ongoing visual reference that felt really poignant for the work, because it was like it had taken the story and put it directly into popular culture, directly into like domestic use. And then kind of interestingly in the 80s, Laura Ashley licensed the fabric and did like a really like garish set of curtains and bed, like, what do you call them, like duvets and things made of this fabric, but they kind of updated the colour scheme into this really 80s like grey and neon pink, so it's quite different.
Wow.
But yeah, I kind of loved that it went into this like really popular culture kind of domestic setting more recently.
Mm. It's amazing, isn't it? I can imagine walking into an 80s bedroom with pelmet, curtains, valance, frilly cushions, all in. It would just be so, so overwhelming. So much. Cool, thank you. Let me just get rid of that image. Yeah, and then actually just looking at that image again of the print, it's really got that same sort of airy, wistful feel that actually I think really comes across with the soundtrack. And sitting here with the gallery just the other side of this wall, I can still kind of hear that soundtrack floating through and kind of sneaking through the cracks in the bricks. And it's a really sort of beautifully melancholic and slightly sort of haunting soundtrack. So I wonder if you could say how you kind of developed that and why.
Yeah, the soundtrack. I wasn't sure whether to have a soundtrack to the animation at first, but I was working with a sound designer, and I'd basically said that I wanted to make something for the soundtrack that would sit somewhere between like really haunting and really serene, but kind of like open to interpretation. And that was the brief really, and for me that was really interesting because the piece that they've come up with it does feel like that. I think some people have interpreted it as like quite sad and in parts of it quite like threatening, but some people find it just like really like chilled to listen to. So it's quite interesting hearing how people feel about it. But there's various things that are kind of woven into it, and I'd like handed over this folder of bits of music and sounds, and one of them was this the soundtrack from, or like the orchestral score from Roadrunner. And Roadrunner was like I'm sure you probably like know the story, but a Looney Tune character, and the story is always a chase scene. That's like the Roadrunner story is just a chase scene every episode. That's all it is. And the kind of meep noise that he makes is the piece that is sampled. So in the exhibition, in the soundtrack, it's actually slowed right down, and you can just about hear it, I think. But I think it's kind of like piercing through the soundtrack to hear it so slow. But I think it is quite recognizable when you know it's what it is. Yeah, so that was kind of, it was really interesting to collaborate and have those references and see how it worked with the film as well. And I think with hand-drawn animation particularly, because you're working with I've generally worked to like 10 frames per second, which is really slow, but when you have music with it, the kind of rhythm of the frames really comes through, and the kind of the music and the animation bounce off each other.
It just got me thinking about the kind of collaborative nature of the show actually, which yes, with working with the sound designer, and also was it your mum that modelled for some of the hand drawings?
Yes, I think I was staying at home for part of the development of it, and I'd asked for a lot of the animation. Quite often, if I want a particular kind of scene, I always either like act it out or ask somebody else to act it out, just so I can see how the body moves or something, and then I'll just film on my phone. So at the moment, I'm making a new animation, and there's a character who's like stamping around, so I've been kind of like stamping around and filming that just to see how like your body falls. It's really fascinating. But yeah, I got my mum to do some there was a particular bit with water. I was finding it really hard to work out how, if you kind of put your hand into a pool of water or your foot, like how the water reacts and how the kind of ripples work. So I got her to do that a few times just to start to like work out what the frames would look like. So yeah, she was very kindly helped out with that. It's a bit of a family collaboration.
Yeah, nice, really nice. The show, well, as you were talking earlier about the boulder in the middle, which also sometimes gets called the mother structure, it transformed on its journey here from Walsall. So the whole show was originally commissioned by the New Art Gallery Walsall, and after being in Portsmouth, it's going to go on to Cardiff. And I wonder if you could explain kind of why you wanted to change it for coming here. So it's not the exact same one lifted and moved to Portsmouth. It has changed shape and kind of design, and how you think it might change again when it goes to Cardiff.
Yeah, so it felt like originally when it was first built for Walsall, it was very site specific, and it was the space there was very, very tall, and I'd kind of designed it particularly for that space. And then when I came to Portsmouth, the gallery has like really specific kind of architecture, and it has the amazing like pillars as well. And then I really wanted to make something that would have like an interplay with them and could kind of it kind of like sits almost between them, so that they like become part of it almost. And I think it felt really like I don't know, it felt like right to make it interact with the building in that way, not just kind of copy paste that main structure in. And also I like the idea of the story kind of evolving. So the painting on the mother structure I redid for Aspex, and it kind of responds to the architecture a little bit. So in certain places you can see, I think there's one particular view of a side angle where you can kind of spot sculptures in, you know, on the left and the right of the structure, and then I've kind of painted reflections of them onto the mother structure, so it kind of all holds together. And I guess that structure itself, I've been thinking a lot about this, the kind of TV window of, I guess, shops of like TV shops of the 90s and 2000s, which you kind of don't really see as much anymore. But I really remember growing up that there was like a Dixon's on one side of the street, and was it Tandy? Is that real?
No,
Yeah,
that's ringing a bell.
on the other side, and they had the windows were just full of TV screens, and they would all play the same show. So you'd have like the same thing just blaring, and as a kid you just always stop and just like become completely absorbed in all of these screens. And there was something about that idea of having like the same thing played on multiple screens that I really liked, and I think that's kind of reflected in the structure itself, having like the multiple screens coming through. It's quite interesting when you see different people watch different screens. So quite often people sit down and they kind of bed in with the one on at floor level and lie on the floor and watch it, which is quite nice.
Yeah, or in our space they'll sort of stand right back against the wall and lean against the wall and look at the ones further up. Yeah, nice. It certainly has an effect on people that go into the gallery, you know, coming out of Gunwharf Quays, where we are probably in the hustle and bustle of shopping and, you know, everyday life, and then they come in, and on their way back out of the gallery you can see that they've really calmed down and really slowed down, and it's had quite an effect, I think, on a lot of people that go in there and just spend a bit of time, you know, by themselves maybe, or yeah, it's good. It's been a lovely show to have in our space, it really has. So I also wanted to talk a bit about what else you do as an artist. And as we said, the show was originally at New Art Gallery Warsaw, and you've got an ongoing relationship with them, and wondered if you'd be willing to talk about the art group that you facilitate with them and the kind of work that you do as an artist running those sessions.
Yeah, sure. So I run a lot of different workshops from with partner organisations like Warsaw and from my studio. And yeah, I run one every week at Warsaw, which is really like about drawing, and everything starts from drawing, and it's about like accessibility to drawing and not having a preconceived idea of what a bad drawing is. I think that's kind of the basis for them, and I'm really passionate about that sort of approach to art education. So the workshops I run there will take that starting point, and I do various similar sorts of workshops from the studio and from Modern Clay Co-op, which all have that kind of ethos as their starting point. So yeah, I think during lockdown, it's a lot of things have been postponed, which is quite strange because I was running probably at least one a week somewhere. And I think the one at Warsaw particularly, we really were aware of like the ongoing, like the importance of consistency with the regularity of a workshop, because we all our people were regulars. So I think our immediate thing was to put that onto WhatsApp. So I run it on WhatsApp every week, and posted out materials to people so they can continue making. And I kind of deliver it every Thursday morning. So I've just done one today. So that's kind of carrying on as normal, which is really nice. But I think the one thing that all the work I do collaborating with other people has its like heart is the hand drawn and the kind of psychological benefits of working in a tactile way with materials, and that's what we can't do at the moment. So I think I'm longer term thinking a lot about how this shift is going to affect that sort of work, and I've kind of tackled it a little bit by posting stuff to people, but yeah, it's definitely different.
Yeah, we've had to do something similar. So some of our learning program has been delivered online, but there's also a WhatsApp group with our the group that is called Generate, that runs here usually on Friday mornings. But you were saying just before we started broadcasting on Zoom, you were talking about your background and how it changes. I wonder if you'd say a bit about that, because I think that's really lovely.
Yeah, just to keep it exciting, I've been making Zoom backgrounds like this one, and it's been quite good. I think good for me to be every couple of weeks making some really physically big and garish thing to sit behind me. So I've really enjoyed doing it, and it reminds me of Art Attack. That's the Art Attack Buchanan, basically, because it's just been quite a good chance to like immerse myself within an image, and my computer's not good enough to do the virtual backgrounds on Zoom, so I think I've just had to create it in real life. But I feel like that's probably a good activity to be doing in lockdown.
Yeah, definitely. Nice. I think one of the reasons that our team have particularly enjoyed working with you and having the show was that you were so willing to also work with like our learning team, particularly talking to visiting school groups and children doing their arts award, and you're also super active in kind of creating opportunities for other artists and for young people through writing and publishing. Do you think you feel a sense of responsibility to do that, or is it that you particularly enjoy that kind of work?
I guess maybe a bit of both. I think one of my major influences really are collaborative based studio practices, so places and people that have at their heart things which are to do with making and access, and social activism a lot of the time. So I think that the places like the Leeds Animation Workshop, which was a group of mainly women who started in the 60s and 70s making animations, with the community, and then which had often like a social cause, or Sister Carita Kent, who was working at Immaculate Heart College, screen printing, educating, and like making work that went into exhibitions but also went into people's homes. So that's like my real like where a lot of my influences have come from, I think. And I think collaborative making is something that's quite important to me. And I started off really making, within as an artist, making comics and making zines. That was like a real starting point. I was very interested in underground publishing and the way that the self-publishing and zine making was like a voice and an outlet for subcultures, and I think that like ethos of creating a situation where people can make zines together is the backbone to a lot of what I do through my studio and also through the groups that I'm part of. It's a lot of that kind of similar framework, and it's really fun making zines with people.
Yeah, it's almost had I think a kind of resurgence in recent years, hasn't it? From being a very kind of underground, kind of punky, music related fanzines, to being something that's, I think, has a different kind of function. But it's a really important thing, I think, for people to do that kind of hand making and feeling quite empowered to put your voice out there. And
it definitely, it has that, like, at its heart it's like about space for people's voices, but also it's kind of, it's like anti-mass production in a way, because zines originally, like pre-internet, were about finding other people who were into the same like niche punk like community that you might have been into, and sharing like meetups or band tour dates or whatever it might be, or particular group of revolutionary feminists having kind of, I don't know, access to domestic violence resources or names of refuges or whatever it might have been. So they were small scale for a reason, because it would be dangerous to make, for a lot of the time, or or not useful to have like these resources mass produced. So I think quite often, like, the people who come to a lot of the workshops I do make zines about and for their community. So they don't, that kind of love that they're not about being like Vogue magazine. They're about serving their community and using it as a tool for communicating.
With Modern Clay and Feminist Work for Change, how has working with them changed over the sort of last 5 months? Have there been big shifts in the kind of priorities for those groups, or is it mainly kind of logistical stuff?
It's been quite tricky really with both of those groups. A lot of the work that we do is based around partnerships, and the partnerships are predominantly with groups like Crisis, who work with people facing homelessness, and Women's Aid in Birmingham. They're the kind of two major partners that I work with regularly. And those services are so frontline at the moment that they're very much still in the middle of the pandemic. So the idea of resuming like normal life is not really like something that we can have conversations about yet. in terms of working together soon. So because those services are really frontline, I think the kind of our normal activities with them won't resume for a while, and our priorities are kind of changing in terms of we're having a lot of conversations around what how we might adjust our work, and I think the like I said about the kind of psychological benefits of working materials, trying to think about how that can continue if it's not about being in a studio, like what will that look like, I think is a kind of key priority to work out at the moment.
Yeah, I've heard other people that are part of Modern Clay talking about how the time for people going into the studio is really important, and how there's a totally different kind of value of the work that's produced in that space, and of of what that offers, than perhaps those of us that go in and out of those spaces all the time, or that perhaps it's more a kind of a regular thing than the like, in particular for people that are homeless, to make an object that you might one day put into a home that you would have is, there's a completely different psychological relationship with that process of making.
Yeah, I think there's having the physical space as well, you have the kind of community of people who are regularly there, and there's a lot of stuff that's really unquantifiable, like the skill sharing that goes on. And I don't just mean like how to roll out a piece of clay as a skill maybe, but also things about just other things that you pick up when you're with other people, chatting to them, and the friendships that come out of that, and the ongoing relationships that happen between people who come to the sessions outside of the workshop, which are I think that's things that we're quite I guess like worried about losing in the longer term, but it might be that we are just making those class sizes much smaller in the longer term. We'll have to see how that works out.
And then how about for yourself as an artist, usually working in your studio and on particular projects, like how have you been finding lockdown, and what have been the really noticeable impacts on the work you're making, either physically or kind of what you want to be making?
I think the studios have remained open, but with quite strict policies in place. So I've been working from home majority of the time, except for going in to use the kiln and a few other things. But I mean, generally I feel really lucky because I can, really privileged position being able to continue working in some ways. So I'd say like probably 50% of my work has been postponed in some way. So generally that's looking like a year of postponement for majority of work. But then a lot of teaching has gone online, and I also, like, strangely, because I work nearly exclusively with hand-drawn processes, but like I'd say about maybe half the work I'm making at the moment is animation, which is digital in its final form. So I feel quite lucky because a lot of the commissions I've been working on that are new work is all animated. So actually working on that is really transferable to working from home, and the output of it may be less of an exhibition and more of an online thing. Or I'm looking at the moment of thinking about other ways of putting that out into the world, I think. It's a strange time, I think, for everyone, but I think I do feel very lucky, and I think I'll be looking forward to getting back to the studio soon, because we can like socially distance really well within the building, so people are generally kind of coming back at the moment.
Good to hear. So I said that we'd open up to questions after 40 minutes. So if anyone wants to type any in, you can absolutely start doing that. There aren't any in at the moment. So until one appears, I'm going to carry on hogging it. Oh, we've got one. So Sarah, could you talk a bit more about the impact of feminism on your work?
Yes. So I guess I've always been interested in feminist art forms, and the way that a lot of the kind of ways I've made work through comics and animation and ceramics have been often like male dominated industries, but then you quite often have had like an underground of feminist artists who have been making work and have this kind of quite revolutionary feminist angle to the sort of more experimental work that they're making. I think I first became interested in feminism because I studied English originally, and particularly linguistics, and there's a lot of really interesting kind of bodies of writing around feminist linguistics, particularly around the idea of like the not an exclusively dominant male narrative, around the kind of multiplicities of voices. And I think that kind of stuck with me after that course. And then in more recent years, I'd been working on a number of projects in women's refuges. I'd done this collaboration with Susan Meiselas, who's a documentary photographer, and we'd done, I think maybe like it's been 2 or 3 year project working with various refuges in the UK, and became really interested in more of that kind of social activism and the huge cuts to domestic violence services and charities. And around that time started working with Feminist Work for Change, who are a kind of West Midlands based working group who really do a lot of work to kind of, everybody's volunteers, but to like essentially support services and organisations that are doing things towards equality for women and girls. And I think through them I've found a kind of space which is slightly separate to a lot of the other work I do. They're not a kind of arts organisation, but I lend a lot of visual identity stuff to them. So I do a lot of a lot of their kind of branding, or anything that needs doing that has a kind of visual side to it. And I also deliver a lot of workshops around kind of production of materials for fundraising, or working directly with the charities and doing art workshops. So yeah, I think there's kind of, it's always been a strand that's run through my work. Yeah, sometimes in really direct action type of feminism, but also as a kind of theoretical basis for a lot of the reasons that I make sort of work that I do.
Thank you. We've got another question that's come through. So Ellen Wilkinson says, thanks for a great talk. I want to ask Sarah about the gaps in the animation. I'm interested in the use of 10 frames a second and what may or may not happen in between, the bits we don't see between frames. Is that somehow relevant to Daphne's story?
Good question. There's loads of like fascinating animation theory about like between the frames, and the idea of all animation as an art form existing between the frames, because when you actually play back an animated film, The frames are, I think, really they generally in big studios range from like 12 to 24 frames per second. So that's the kind of point which, when you're watching images in motion, that they trick your mind into seeing moving image. I slowed it down very slightly, but I think you can still kind of just kind of see the individual kind of makers, you know, my kind of brushstrokes of the frames, but it also is sort of in places really very like dynamic. But yeah, sorry, as I was saying, that in animation theory, there's this idea that animation itself exists just between the frames in that space where it does kind of come to life. I really like that idea that it's kind of relevant to Daphne's story. I could do with thinking a bit more about that. I think the actual kind of animation feels like it is Daphne, because it kind of, I was interested in it being this like embodied film. So the exhibition is sort of, it embodies the actual film as like a physical thing, where a lot of the sculptures relate to drawings in individual frames, and the sort of central mother structure, kind of this living thing. Doesn't really answer your question, Ellen, but
I wonder, I think certainly from the point of view of seeing different visitors come in and sort of observing how some people will, you know, read the text panel, they'll read a handout, they may go away and do more research into the full story, and for other people they won't necessarily read any of that interpretation, and they might not know the story of Daphne and Apollo. And I suppose with it being it's a contemporary art exhibition, so there will be details about that story that will be completely missed by a lot of visitors, and they'll see the shape at the front that you and I know references a tunnel that Roadrunner runs into, but they won't know that, or they'll come in and not know why there are leaves and why there's a figure, and so I think those gaps are really important, because it allows people to find their own sort of depth of interest, really, as to how far into a work or how far into an exhibition they want to go. And certainly with this story, we talked about it quite a lot as the staff team before installing, was just how much to sort of explain, and because ultimately what Apollo wants to do is rape Daphne, and we have a lot of family visitors coming in and some very young children, and that's not something that we can, you know, boldly say to small children is what happened in that story. It's very much kind of open to families to have those conversations if they want to. And I think it's also coming back to this kind of feeling in the show of a kind of serenity, but also a slight threat. You know, as you've talked about, that kind of predator and prey, and there being a kind of ambiguity there about the relationship between these two characters in the story. And I think you create a really interesting space for thinking about that, and those kind of wider issues, as wider topics. But creating a safe space for it.
Yeah, I was quite keen for the film to be like very abstract from the very overly kind of symbolic narrative of the original myth, where you know, in a lot of art history, the paintings of Daphne are this like nymph-like woman who's got branches with leaves coming out of her arms and stuff. So it's kind of like I wanted to move away from that, and the film really is just about two bodies. Like you can't really see any kind of signs of a gendered depiction of the bodies, and it's very I very much wanted it to step away from that and be more kind of a depiction of a power imbalance, or questioning a power imbalance between two characters, and that is kind of explored through touch, essentially, because the scenes are essentially a series of a chase, but also a series of moments where the bodies touch each other, in this kind of very slowed down way. And within those scenes, it's quite often, even just within people I've spoken to who've seen it, they're very open to interpretation. Some people see the hand holding as this kind of very intimate hand holding. Some people see it as a very threatening grasp, and it really is kind of the way that the lines move so kind of fluidly. They're not stationary in any way. The ink, that it's sort of, you're constantly sort of looking and trying to read it, and that, I think, is you're kind of in this in between state, trying to interpret whether it is something sinister going on.
I wanted to ask you, and it's come through as a question from Joe, kind of. I was going to ask you whether you've kind of reflected on the kind of change in our feelings about seeing kind of touch in, this side of a global pandemic where everyone's keeping 2 meters social distance. And Joe sent through a question: would you be willing to talk about what kind of influences or themes you're currently working on for future projects, and whether the pandemic has shifted your thinking or concerns beyond the practical issues? So I'm going to meld those two questions together into are you thinking about how this work is different now that we're all uncomfortable touching each other, and how's that affecting you thinking about making new work?
So the first part, there's two things really. The first thing, with Daphne, it's so much of it is about touch, and like the inherent theme of animation, hand-drawn animation, is touch, because it's with so much experimental early animation, you can see fingerprints on the paper, you can see this incredibly like tactile relationship with the artist on like a mass scale. So and then within the actual film, it explores touch itself. So now watching it back and seeing it, it absolutely is like, feels very different now. And yeah, I haven't, I guess, had a lot of time to digest that, because it feels like we're still really in it. Which is quite a kind of strange, and a strange thing for the film to have shifted in that way. But as things quite so often do, their meaning shifts. And I think in terms of what Joe was asking about, it shifting in terms of thinking about new work, it's been quite interesting, actually. The new films that I'm making are, there's one I'm making with East Side Projects at the moment, which has been going on for about maybe since January, which is a new hand-drawn animation. And it's, again, the kind of meaning of it has shifted due to the pandemic, because it's about the idea of going for a walk. And everybody's been doing their like daily walk. But I've been collaborating with a group of year 5 children from Fordbridge Primary School, and they had their kind of imagination had fueled the story of the film. So it's very kind of directly inspired by conversations I'd had with this school, with this group of school children. And then the idea was they were going to voice the film. So I was supposed to be this week actually finishing that, but that's been kind of postponed indefinitely. So, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to do that at some point, where I will be able to go back and work with the children to actually voice the film and have that kind of, they're going to be a kind of similarly experimental soundtrack which will accompany the visuals. And the new kind of films I'm making have that kind of more collaborative starting point at their heart. So I'm thinking a lot about how I can do that now without actually seeing people, and I think it's really possible. But it's working out kind of the logistics of what that might look like, and it's just really shifted what the meaning of those films ends up being. So with the project, with these sub-projects in the school, the film is about going for a walk, but it's turned out that for all the children who I've been working with, they've been kind of forced out on this daily walk with their family because for their like daily exercise, and it's become a kind of it's a real thing for people really to be going out for their daily walk, and the school are really kind of pushing that as a thing to be doing. So the film's like really shifted in what it means, like it has had to. So I think it really has, but I think primarily for me in terms of the actual collaborative nature of what I've been doing, and kind of like trying to really hold on to the hand-drawn kind of tactile nature of the work that I make, which is really the kind of underpinning of all the work I make, has that at its heart, but also be flexible to be having digital ways of collaborating and other ways of collaborating, and having a kind of digital output to some of that work.
I think we'll wrap it up there. Oh, getting echo. I think we'll wrap it up there because I've said that people could watch this on the lunch break, and that's nearly an hour, so people probably need to go and turn the Zoom off, open up your inbox again. So thank you so much. We've got one chat coming through saying thank you. Thank you everybody for watching. As I said, we've recorded this, so we'll put that up on YouTube as soon as possible, and then you can share it with all your friends and relations. Thank you so much, Sarah, and we've loved having Daphne in our gallery, and we're very sad to take it down next week. So
thanks so much. Thanks everybody for coming to listen in your lunch breaks.
Yeah, and come and see the show. You've got till Sunday. Right, I'm gonna see if we can somehow stop the broadcasting.